as the trend is in America. Smaller towns are dying. As the population gets older, they need medical services and so forth. And thus the population leaves, the towns decline, tax base is gone, buildings deteriorate. County and town histories cover a wide range of quality of effort. A few of them are exceptionally well done, a lot of thorough research with a history of the towns and of the businesses and of cemeteries and other than just the family history section. Others are simply that. They're filled with family history with maybe 5 pages devoted to the real history, the economic history, the social history. So that's the sad story. When you go to research many of these places, there isn't a whole lot of material.
The history in this area is very, very rich. There's a lot of stuff that goes unsaid. We're kind of the forgotten part of South Dakota. You hear of the Black Hills and you hear of the Badlands. And this is the land of Sitting Bull. Of all your great Indian chiefs came out of this area, out of Corson County, or the Standing Rock Reservation, and the leadership that came from those Indian people. And then as it transitions into the homestead days and the coal mining and the cattle ranching and those huge cattle ranches at the turn of the century between 1890 and 1910, it's just very, very rich in history.
So this was all developed, and there would have been businesses every 25 feet, because these lots are all platted out for 25 feet. But this was all developed, and there was businesses all along here. And then in the 30s and 40s, there was a big fire, and it wiped out almost all of these businesses.
And the carloads of coal that used to go on a fire steel in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was probably some of the biggest coal mining the state of South Dakota has ever seen. The amount of people that used to live there, there was well over 500 people that lived in the fire steel area. And today you go through there and there's 6 or 8. And they used to have a flour mill and all your general stores and auto parts dealerships and implements and all that stuff, and it's all gone. And you can still see the bank vault.
But the town of Firesteel took it a step further and developed it into an industry. Firesteel coal was used by most of the colleges and at one time heated the state capitol building. The company, because they had a railroad, they had a branch of the Milwaukee Road serving the town. They were able to ship all this stuff out by rail car. And they operated until 1959. The railroad was the major influence in South Dakota for so many places. Where the route of the railroad was going to be actually made or broke many a town.
Nashville was built there. Camp Crook started first, and then the next year or two Nashville got started back up the creek from Camp Crook. Around 1884 is when Nashville would have gotten started. And he had a little store there, from what I understand. It lasted for a while, and got a post office. And then by about 1887 or thereabouts, a guy named Stokes came in and settled on a claim there where Harding sits now, and then he went and bought out the Nashville store and moved it down to his place. And then he ended up with the post office a few years after that, and his daughter ran it, as far as I can tell. The old house that Stokes built, and there was a warehouse that they had that has been converted into kind of a garage, and the old dance hall, the modern Woodman Hall originally, that's still standing.
There was at least 26 ghost towns listed in Custer County, and of all them 26, there's very few left that show you could find signs of them being still there. Spokane is one that has most of the old buildings and the old mine stuff there. Some places are just gone and went right back to nature, and all it is just something written on paper that the town was there. Everybody was looking for gold. It's like the family that founded Spokane. It was a Judd family, and they come west and they found this little vein in the side of a hill over here in the eastern part of the hills, and he set up a claim there in a cold winter night, and they had the rocks on his stove, and in the morning there was a puddle of silver on the stove, and they found out there was lead in this mine. And more people come and they built their homes there, and before you know it, there was a town. And then there was a Mr. Shepherd, and he staked his claim, but he stuck his stake a little farther over where he should have. And this Mr. Cox, it was over on his side of the land, and one day Mr. Shepherd got shot with a shotgun, and it took him a while to die. Nobody witnessed the shooting, So they couldn't really say that Mr. Cox shot him, but everybody knew he did. But Mr. Shepherd is buried on the mine site. I often think some night when it gets dark and the moon comes over the hill and it gets real quiet, you can almost hear him out there wailing.
The 100 square miles of the Black Hills was just peppered with these little small towns. Most have been pretty much vanished. If you went out there in the summers, you'd be hard-pressed to find many ruins. Trojan was about 6 miles out of Lead to the west, up by the ski slopes, right on the edge of Terry Peak. Major mining area. It was called the Ruby Basin, which was a conglomerate of many mines. It was a small metropolitan area. Trojan itself was originally known as Portland. Portland became the Trojan Mining Company, and then I think it was about in the 19-teens when it became the Bald Mountain Mining Company. It was a town with its businesses, grocery stores. It had its own school, which was the last building demolished. They didn't demolish that until 2010. No, it was a major town, right up there with Lead and Deadwood. It was a railroad center, not only for the Black Hills railroads like the Burlington and the Chicago Northwestern, but there was spurs off of those that went out to some of these smaller towns and smaller mines that have since disappeared. And then the mine itself had quite a system of rails. But it was a major producer right up there with Homestake up until 1959. Right after it closed, there was some businessmen from Milwaukee, Wisconsin that wanted to build a tourist resort up there. And they actually did get a start with it. Going back to railroads, they took trains to 2 different sites full of tourists. I was one of those tourists and just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. They were calling it the Top of the Hills. And at one point, they were trying to evict any of the residents that were left because they wanted all the buildings that were any good to be used in their resort plans. But it was major plans. It only lasted about 2 years. And at that time, the town was pretty much vacant. The next inhabitants of the town of Trojan were migrants from eastern South Dakota. Many of the young folks that came out to the Black Hills from the Sioux Falls and surrounding area ended up settling in Trojan. It was the revival. It really truly was the revival of Trojan. It was thriving with all these young folks. They had bands up there. I think Red Willow was up there, Jack Kreitzer. Yeah, in the 60s and the 70s in particular, it was quite thriving with all these young folks. But the first time I found it, I kind of came in the back door. We were out running around the woods, and I had no idea really where I was. And all of a sudden, we came around the curve on this railroad grade, and here was this big, huge mill that I'd been to as a little kid when they tried to make this tourist thing. But I just kind of accidentally stumbled on it and thought, oh, wow, this is great. And then I started, after that, going up there fairly often. It was quite a place. I used to love to four-wheel drive up there. There was another mine that was first part of Wharf that they mined. It was called the Reliance Mine. And I loved prowling around in these mines. It was just a great place to explore. A lot of history, a lot of artifacts, and it was all still there. You could go out and touch it, take pictures of it, take people there and show it to them, but it's all gone.
Growing up in Spearfish, Tinton was kind of always in the background. There was a place called Tinton Road, and in high school we used to go up Tinton Road and go do things that we probably shouldn't have done. But I've always been outdoorsy, so when I went to the woods, I went up Tinton Road. And in 1983, I went hunting with a buddy of mine, Scott Christensen, and we drove up here, and the next thing you know, we went by the town of Tinton. It was like the first time I'd seen it since, probably the early 70s. And I just thought it was great. I mean, here was a ready-made town sitting in the woods all by itself.
and it was kind of mysterious and interesting all at the same time. The construction of Tinton began in November of 1902, but it didn't begin to function as a community per se until the late spring, early summer of 1903. And there was a boarding house for the bachelor miners, there were cottages for the miners that had families, there was the post office in the early days, there was a bank, there was a stagecoach that came up here 3 times a week in the early days. And it was, by the summer of 1903, it was a thriving little metropolis. It was kind of the darling of the Black Hills at that point. There was a school. It changed locations. These buildings, their functions changed over the years. One time the mercantile was the boarding house, and then the boarding house became the schoolhouse, and then it was torn down. They switched places for the post office at least twice. But the school that everyone associates with Tinton now was built in 1936, and it was on the north end of town. And there were approximately 25 students in 2 classrooms. As far as I'm concerned, Tinton is still the best example of a ghost town in the Black Hills region. And the term ghost town is alluring all by itself. Now, once you start looking at photographs of how it used to be, maybe 100 years ago or 120 years ago, interest picks up in most people. The last step in this process is to actually visit it. And it doesn't take too much imagination once you visit a ghost town to get a sense of what it must have been like. It's like putting together a century-old jigsaw puzzle that explains the past. You put enough pieces together, it becomes obvious, at least to me, that Tinton isn't a ghost town. It's a place where history comes alive and the past becomes real.
Everything is vanishing so quickly today. It's important. If you want a record of any sort, you better do it now. While we preserve the past, we'll do our very best, and that's what all historians do, and hopefully there'll be a continued interest in the past. Without a past, there isn't much of a future.